Marie Thompson was a black sharecropper working on land owned by John Irvin, a white landowner. One day, while she and her son were tending her vegetable garden, Irvin approached them, demanding the return of a pair of pliers. Thompson's son told him that the tool had already been returned, but Irvin accused the boy of stealing it, berating him and kicking him multiple times in the back. Thompson defended her son, confronting Irvin. Upset by her defiance, Irvin ordered Thompson to get off his land, effectively evicting her and stripping her of her home, income, and dignity. Frustrated and desperate, Thompson struck back. According to Thompson, she complied but walked away slowly on purpose. This angered Irvin further, and he attempted to attack her from behind with a knife. Thompson, a woman weighing 255 pounds, managed to overpower him and, in self-defense, fatally cut his throat with a razor. After the incident, she sold her horse and furniture to neighbors, preparing to leave before her eventual arrest. Thompson was arrested, jailed, and charged with murder. The same day, the Courier-Journal published an article reporting on Irvin's death. That night, an armed group of about a dozen white men gathered to form a lynch mob, surrounding the jail in Lebanon Junction at midnight on June 14, 1904, with the intention of hanging Thompson. One member of the mob used a sledgehammer to strike at the large padlock securing a heavy iron bar across the jail door. As the mob worked to break in, a group of armed African American men appeared behind them and opened fire. The white men, caught by surprise, fled the scene, returning only a few wild shots in their retreat. The sound of gunfire soon drew many villagers to the jail. After the white county sheriff and his deputies assured the mob that Thompson would be protected if they returned, the group of black men dispersed, and the immediate threat was quelled. 2 hours later, at 2 a.m., a mob of 50 men arrived at the jail. With no response from law enforcement, they forcibly removed Marie Thompson from her cell, dragging her by a rope tied around her neck. The mob attempted to hang her from a tree in the jail yard. Realizing that pleading for mercy wouldn't save her, Thompson fought back like a tiger, with one account describing her as an Amazon tiger. Despite her resistance, the 50 men eventually managed to slip a noose around her neck, throw it over a branch, and lift her off the ground. But Thompson twisted her body, grabbed hold of one of the lynchers by the collar, snatched his knife, and cut the hemp rope. As she dropped to the ground, she began swinging at the drunken men. She managed to break free and ran, but was met with a barrage of over 100 gunshots. When she finally collapsed, the mob cheered. Thompson died the next evening in the Shepherdsville County Jail. On her deathbed, she told her doctor, "I didn't want to kill him. I only wanted to pay him back for what he had done to me and my boy." Thompson's defense highlighted how black families in the South at the turn of the century were willing to protect their own from violence at the hands of white aggressors. Having broken their promise to protect Marie Thompson, the sheriff and his deputies, along with the white residents of Lebanon Junction, feared that the local black people would seek revenge. To prepare, the whites armed themselves and stood guard for several nights, anticipating an attack that never came. Between 1902 and 1904, 11 African Americans were lynched in Springfield, Ohio, with most of those responsible receiving only light sentences. Richard Dickerson, also known as Richard Dolan, moved to Springfield from Cynthiana, Kentucky. Some who knew him described him as having a bad reputation. On Sunday, March 6, 1904, he had an altercation with a woman he referred to as his wife, and asked Police Sergeant Charles B. Collis for assistance in retrieving something from her. Following this, Dickerson allegedly shot the woman and Sergeant Collis. As news of the shooting spread, there was talk of lynching Dickerson. The following day, Monday, March 7, 1904, Collis succumbed to his injuries, fueling the mob's determination to lynch Dickerson. Members of the Anti-Mob and Lynch Law Association urged the sheriff to request additional help, but he insisted he could protect the prisoner. At 9 p.m. on March 7, 1904, a mob gathered outside the jail, demanding that Sheriff Routzen hand over Richard Dickerson. Sheriff Routzen addressed the crowd, ordering them to disperse and stating that he would defend Dickerson, pledging to do his duty at whatever cost. Momentarily deterred, the crowd attempting to force open one of the jail doors retreated. Believing the danger had passed, the sheriff relaxed, but shortly after, a large mob returned and breached the south entrance of the jail, overwhelming Sheriff Rousen and his deputies. Inside, the mob used sledgehammers to break through the iron partitions. Eventually, the sheriff surrendered Dickerson to the mob. They found him cowering in the corner of his cell. Albert Loback and George Hill reportedly led the mob. The mob dragged Dickerson outside to a paved lot, forming a square around him. He was knocked to the ground and shot 9 times as he lay there. The men then moved his body to Fountain Avenue, tying a rope around his neck. 2 members of the mob climbed a telegraph pole and fastened the rope, hanging Dickerson's lifeless body from it. The mob continued shooting at his corpse for another hour, passing guns around so multiple people could participate. It was estimated that 26 revolvers were involved, and Dickerson's body was riddled with bullets. In response, Governor Myron T. Herrick sent 10 companies of the Ohio National Guard to restore order in the town. On March 8, 1904, the day after the lynching, a mob of over 1,000 people gathered at the rail yards, planning an attack on an area known as the Levee, a predominantly African-American neighborhood with several saloons. The mob collected flammable materials and split into 3 groups, each targeting a different saloon to burn. By the end of the night, 7 buildings had been destroyed. Although the fire department arrived, they did not intervene and allowed the buildings to burn. During the riot, Company A of the 9th Battalion, largely composed of African-American soldiers, made no effort to respond. City officials requested additional support from the governor, who sent 5 more companies of soldiers, bringing the total to 15. On March 9th, African-American residents were instructed to stay indoors. In one reported incident, 5 shots were fired at a black man who was seen on the street. Colonel Meade, who was in charge of the troops, eventually restored order. After conducting an autopsy, the coroner reported, "I am unable to determine the direct cause of death." Albert Loback and George Hill, identified as leaders of the mob, were later arrested and charged with malicious destruction of property. By March 16th, Anna Corbin, the woman who Dickerson had shot, filed a $5,000 lawsuit against the city, holding it responsible for Dickerson's lynching. In the summer of 1904, several Ohio National Guard officers were court-martialed for failing to mobilize their units in response to the riots. Judge Advocate Edward Vollrath, an attorney and regimental commander, led the prosecution. However, the defendants successfully argued that, without activation orders from the governor, they were not obligated to mobilize their soldiers. On July 29, 1908, 21-year-old Lily Davis was brutally attacked in her Gold Point home. While her husband was away, an assailant assaulted her and inflicted severe injuries. He slit her throat, struck her in the head with a Colt revolver stolen from the residence, and then fled the scene. Davis's young daughter was also injured during the attack. Lily Davis was later transported to a nearby hospital for treatment. 2 hours later, a sheriff's deputy apprehended Leander Shaw near the Bayou, Texas bridge, immediately identifying him as the suspected attacker. Shaw was reportedly found with the stolen revolver and a bloodied knife in his possession. He was taken to the hospital where Lily Davis was being treated, and she immediately identified him as her assailant. Shaw was then placed in custody and held at the county jail. Tragically, Lily Davis succumbed to her injuries 3 days later on August 1st. By 7 p.m., a crowd began gathering outside the Escambia County Jail. Sheriff James C. Van Pelt of Escambia County attempted to reason with the mob, urging them to disperse, but his efforts were unsuccessful. Speaking to the Pensacola News Journal, he declared, "Gentlemen, here I am. You can kill me if you want to, but if you get my prisoner, it will be over my dead body. I have sworn to do my duty, and I am going to do it, if I die for it." At 8:45 p.m., the mob forced their way into the jail, using a section of streetcar rail to break through the yard gate. Deputies stationed on the second floor fired warning volleys at the advancing crowd. Sheriff Van Pelt spoke to the mob for 30 minutes, but tensions escalated and he and his deputies eventually opened fire. A violent gunfight ensued, resulting in injuries on both sides. 2 people were killed. Bud Nichols, a member of the mob, was shot in the head, and Henry C. Kellum, a streetcar conductor, was fatally shot in the heart when Sheriff Van Pelt's revolver accidentally discharged while in his pocket. Around 11:30 p.m., approximately a dozen members of the mob scaled the rear wall of the jail and entered the backyard. While officers were preoccupied with the crowd at the front of the jail, these men moved quietly, surprising the deputies. They overpowered several officers, holding some at gunpoint and forcing others to the ground. The mob seized the jail keys from Deputy Cusacks, took Leander Shaw, and placed a noose around his neck. Shaw was dragged east along Zaragoza Street to Tarragona Street and then to Plaza Ferdinand 7. There, the mob tied a rope to an electrical pole, hanged Shaw, and riddled his body with more than 500 bullets. Luther Holbert was born into slavery around 1852 in Mississippi. He gained his freedom after the end of the American Civil War in 1865. In 1884, he married Annie, with whom he had 4 children. Holbert also had 1 child with a mistress. On Wednesday, February 3, 1904, a white landowner named James Eastland confronted Holbert, intending to force him off the plantation. The encounter turned violent, resulting in the deaths of 3 men. During the struggle, it was alleged that Holbert shot both Eastland and an African-American man named John Carr. In response, Eastland reportedly returned fire, killing another black man named John Winters. Some accounts suggested that Eastland attacked Holbert due to Holbert's efforts to encourage other indebted black workers to escape the oppressive bondage-like conditions of labor on the plantation. News of the incident spread, prompting the formation of a posse. Relatives of Eastland offered a $1,200 reward. Upon arriving at the Eastland plantation, they killed an unidentified black man, while Holbert and an unnamed black woman had already fled. Several posses equipped with bloodhounds were organized to pursue them. On February 4, 1904, one of these groups killed 2 other black men who happened to cross their paths. On February 5, 1904, Holbert's 16-year-old son was taken into custody under suspicion of involvement, but was later released. Finally, on Sunday, February 7, 1904, a posse located Holbert and the woman early in the morning, sleeping in a wooded area near Shepherdstown, close to Morgan City, Mississippi. It was reported that around 1,000 people gathered and cheered as Luther Holbert and an unidentified woman were tortured and killed by a lynch mob. The crowd created a festive atmosphere, with people eating deviled eggs, drinking lemonade and whiskey, and even taking body parts of the victims as gruesome souvenirs. The lynching was planned for a Sunday afternoon to attract a large crowd, and it took place on the grounds of a black church in Doddsville. The mob brought Holbert and the woman back to Doddsville, where they were tied to a tree as a fire was prepared. Members of the crowd severed their fingers and ears, distributing these as mementos. Holbert endured a severe beating, leaving one of his eyes hanging from its socket. Some in the mob used large corkscrews to pierce his legs and torso, twisting them in and out, tearing away chunks of flesh, as described by the Vicksburg Evening Post, which reported that they bore them into the flesh and pulled out the spirals, tearing out big pieces of raw, quivering flesh every time. Both victims remained conscious when led to the fire. The mob burned the woman first, making Holbert watch, and then he was burned as well. C.C. Eastland was arrested for the murder of Holbert and the woman. However, when the case went before a judge on September 22, 1904, Eastland's attorney filed a motion to dismiss the charges. The judge granted the motion, dismissing all charges and releasing Eastland. Reports indicate that a large crowd applauded the decision. No one was ever prosecuted for the lynching.